Thinking Fast and Slow, a sleepy summary. There is a book, a very good book, written by a man named Daniel Kahneman, who spent most of his long and careful life thinking about how people think, which is a bit like spending your life watching water to understand wetness. But he did it anyway, and it turned out to be enormously useful, and the book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it is the kind of book that makes you feel very smart while you are reading it, and then slightly embarrassed the next morning when you realize you made the exact same mistake the book warned you about, which is fine, because that is more or less the point, and we will get to all of that very slowly in the most gentle and unhurried way possible, so that by the time we are done you will know everything important and also be extremely ready for sleep. So, Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist, not an economist, which is interesting because he won the Nobel Prize in economics, which tells you something either about him or about economics or possibly about both, and what he spent his career doing, mostly together with his friend and collaborator Amos Tversky, who was brilliant and charming and died before the prize was awarded, which is one of the sadder parts of the story, was studying the ways in which human beings are not perfectly rational. Not because they are stupid, but because their minds are doing something much more complicated and interesting than simple logic. And the whole book is really an extended and loving exploration of that complicated, interesting thing. The central idea, the spine around which everything else is arranged, is that the mind is not one thing but two things, or rather that it operates in two distinct modes, and Kahneman calls these System 1 and System 2, which are not the most poetic names, but they are clear, and that is what matters. And System 1 is the fast one, the automatic one, the one that is always running in the background like the operating system of a computer, humming away quietly and handling most of what you do without your awareness or consent. And System 2 is the slow one, the deliberate one, the one that requires effort and concentration, and that you have to consciously engage, the one that shows up when you are trying to do long division in your head or fill out your tax forms or parallel park in a tight spot. And the relationship between these two systems, the way they cooperate and conflict, and sometimes spectacularly mislead each other, is what the whole book is about. System 1 is extraordinary. It is fast beyond comprehension. It is constantly active. It is the reason you can drive a familiar route while thinking about something else entirely and arrive at your destination without any conscious recollection of having navigated there. It is the reason you can read these words without having to sound out each letter. It is the reason you know immediately upon walking into a room whether the atmosphere is tense or warm or somewhere in between. It is the reason you flinch before you have consciously registered the thing you flinched at. And it is doing all of this all the time, without rest, without asking permission, building models of the world and updating them and making predictions and generating feelings and impressions and intuitions. And it does all of this extraordinarily well most of the time, which is why it exists, because evolution built it over a very long time precisely because it is useful. Precisely because fast automatic pattern recognition is often exactly what you need to survive and navigate a complex social world. But System 1 has quirks. It has tendencies and habits and blind spots. It uses shortcuts, which Kahneman calls heuristics, and these shortcuts work well enough in most circumstances, but produce systematic errors in others, and these systematic errors are called biases. And the study of these biases is really the heart of what Kahneman and Tversky devoted their careers to. And the list of them is long and varied and sometimes startling and always, once you understand them, recognizable because you have experienced them yourself. You just did not know they had names. System 2, by contrast, is lazy. This is not an insult, it is just a description. System 2 is effortful, and effort is metabolically expensive, and the mind is a biological organ trying to conserve resources, and so System 2 does as little as it can get away with, which means it tends to endorse whatever System 1 has already concluded rather than rigorously checking the work, which is a bit like a supervisor who rubber stamps everything that crosses their desk without reading it because they are very tired and also trust their assistant, except the assistant is System 1, which, as we are establishing, is very good but not infallible. There is a concept called cognitive ease, which is the comfortable feeling of things going smoothly, of information processing without friction. And when cognitive ease is high, System 1 is happily in charge and everything feels fine and familiar and true. And when cognitive ease is low, when something unexpected or confusing or hard to process enters awareness, System 2 gets mobilized, gets called in, gets asked to pay attention. And this is the natural division of labor between the two systems. And it mostly works. And the reason it mostly works is that most of the things we encounter in daily life are things we have encountered before in some form, things our System 1 has already built models for, things that can be handled adequately on autopilot. The trouble comes in the modern world, which is full of situations that are superficially familiar but structurally different from anything our ancestors faced, situations where our intuitions, honed for a different environment, led us astray, where the heuristics that served us well on the savannah produce nonsense in the boardroom or the polling place or the hospital. And this is the practical importance of understanding all of this, understanding where your own mind is likely to be unreliable, understanding when to slow down and engage System 2 rather than trusting the quick, comfortable answer that System 1 is already preparing. Let us talk about some of the heuristics, the shortcuts, the places where the mental machinery produces predictable errors. There is the availability heuristic, which is the tendency to judge the probability or frequency of something by how easily examples come to mind, by how available they are in memory. And this is a reasonable shortcut, because things that happen often do tend to leave more vivid traces in memory. But it goes wrong when availability is influenced by things other than actual frequency, like vividness or emotional intensity or media coverage. And the classic example is that people reliably overestimate the frequency of dramatic causes of death, like plane crashes and shark attacks, and underestimate the frequency of mundane ones like heart disease and diabetes, because plane crashes are memorable and dramatic, and make the news and therefore come easily to mind when you try to estimate how dangerous flying is. while heart disease kills quietly and routinely and does not make headlines. And so your intuitive sense of the relative dangers is badly distorted. And this is not stupidity, it is the availability heuristic operating exactly as designed, just in an environment where the design assumptions no longer hold, because we live in a world saturated with news about rare dramatic events. There is the representativeness heuristic, which is perhaps the most important of all, the tendency to judge the probability of something by how closely it resembles a prototype or fits a pattern, by how representative it is of a category, and this produces a famous error called the conjunction fallacy, illustrated by the Linda problem, which Kahneman describes in some detail and which has delighted and frustrated psychology students for decades. And the problem goes like this. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, which is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement? And the vast majority of people, including people who should know better, say that the second option is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist, which is logically impossible because the conjunction of two events can never be more probable than either event alone. A bank teller and a feminist is a subset of all bank tellers, so there are necessarily fewer feminist bank tellers than bank tellers in general. But it feels more likely because it fits the description better. Because it is more representative. Because the description of Linda practically screams feminist, and so the version of events that includes feminist feels more probable, even though it is mathematically constrained to be less so. There is the anchoring effect, which is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered when making decisions, the anchor, and to make estimates that are insufficiently adjusted away from that anchor, even when the anchor is arbitrary or irrelevant. And experiments demonstrating this are almost offensive in their clarity, because you can show people a random number generated by spinning a wheel, and then ask them to estimate something completely unrelated. Like the percentage of African countries in the United Nations, and the people who saw a high number on the wheel will give higher estimates than the people who saw a low number, even though they all know the wheel is random, even though the wheel has nothing to do with the question, even though they would be appalled to learn their answers were influenced by a spinning wheel. But they undeniably were, because the anchor gets into the system, and the adjustment process always stops too soon. Never moves far enough from the starting point. There is the affect heuristic, which is the tendency to make judgments based on emotional responses, to use how you feel about something as a proxy for how good or bad or risky or beneficial it is. And this produces systematic relationships between perceived benefits and perceived risks that mirror your emotional attitudes toward things rather than any objective calculation, so that things you like seem both more beneficial and less risky than they are, and things you dislike seem both less beneficial and more risky, because your feelings are doing the evaluating, and feelings are not good at distinguishing between these dimensions. There is the halo effect, which is the tendency for your overall impression of a person or thing to influence your judgments about their specific qualities, so that if someone is physically attractive, you tend to assume they are also intelligent and kind and competent. And if someone says something insightful in a meeting, you tend to assume everything else they say will also be insightful. And if a product looks well designed, you tend to assume it works well. And the halo effect is pervasive and mostly invisible, and it means that first impressions carry an enormous amount of weight because they set the emotional tone that colors everything that comes after. There is what Kahneman calls the "what you see is all there is" principle, which he also refers to with the somewhat ungainly acronym YCRT. And this is the tendency to build coherent stories out of whatever information happens to be present without adequately accounting for the information that is absent, to make confident judgments based on incomplete evidence without flagging the incompleteness. And this is System 1 at work. System 1, which loves coherent narratives and does not love uncertainty, and will gladly construct a complete and confident picture of the world out of a small handful of data points, without pausing to ask whether those data points are representative or whether there might be important information missing. And this tendency is responsible for a great deal of overconfidence, for the feeling of knowing more than you know, for the ease with which people form strong opinions about things they have limited information about. The section of the book about heuristics and biases is really the foundation on which everything else rests. But the book does not stop there. It goes on to cover a remarkable range of territory, all of it connected to this central theme of the unreliability and the ingenuity of human judgment. And one of the most important areas it covers is overconfidence. Overconfidence is pervasive and dangerous, and also extremely understandable once you understand YCRT. Because if you build stories out of available information without adequately accounting for missing information, your stories will tend to feel more complete and certain than they are. Your assessments will tend to feel more accurate than they are. Your predictions will tend to feel more reliable than they are. And the feeling of confidence is not a reliable guide to actual accuracy, which is a deeply uncomfortable thought because we use confidence as a guide to accuracy all the time. We trust confident people more than uncertain people. We trust our own confident feelings more than our uncertain ones. And yet confidence and accuracy are frequently uncoupled. Kahneman tells a story about an assessment he did of a training program for Israeli military officers when he was young, in which he observed squads of candidates completing a leaderless group challenge, and then made predictions about how each candidate would perform in officer training. And these predictions felt very confident and intuitive and clear. And then he learned that the predictions were worthless, that they had essentially no correlation with actual performance. And yet the next week he went back and watched more candidates and made more predictions, and the predictions felt just as confident and clear as before. And this is what he calls the illusion of validity, the feeling of accuracy that persists in the face of evidence of inaccuracy. And it is stubborn and uncomfortable and extremely common. Experts, it turns out, are often not much better than statistical models at making predictions in complex domains, and they are often dramatically overconfident. And the reason for this is partly YCRT and partly what Kahneman calls the narrative fallacy, the tendency to create causal stories that connect the past into a coherent sequence that feels inevitable in retrospect. Because once you know how things turned out, it is very easy to construct a story in which that outcome was the natural and foreseeable result of the preceding events. And this is the hindsight bias, the sense that you knew it all along, that the outcome was obvious, which is deeply pernicious because it makes it impossible to accurately assess how predictable things actually were before they happened. And it makes people who got things right feel more justified, and people who got things wrong feel more culpable than is really warranted. There is an entire section of the book about the question of whether intuition can be trusted, which is a genuinely complex question, because sometimes expert intuition is extraordinarily reliable, and sometimes it is not. And the key variable seems to be the environment, specifically whether the environment provides regular and rapid feedback that allows learning to occur. Because System 1 learns through repeated exposure and feedback. And in environments where feedback is clear and consistent and timely, like chess or firefighting or certain aspects of medicine, genuine expertise can develop and intuitions can be trusted. But in environments where feedback is delayed or absent or noisy, or where the situation itself is irregular and unpredictable, like long-range economic forecasting or predicting political events or evaluating job candidates in a single interview. Expert intuition is often no better than chance and is usually accompanied by unjustified confidence. The book then takes a turn that might seem like a digression, but is not, into the strange and important question of how we think about outcomes, how we evaluate gains and losses, how we make decisions under uncertainty, and this is the territory of prospect theory, which is the formal theory that Kahneman and Tversky developed to describe how people actually make decisions as opposed to how they would make decisions if they were the rational agents of classical economics. Classical economics assumes that people are rational maximizers of expected utility, that they evaluate outcomes based on their overall effect on wealth, that they treat equivalent gains and losses symmetrically, that they are consistent in their preferences, and that they can calculate probabilities and apply them correctly. And all of these assumptions turn out to be wrong, which is not surprising to anyone who has ever met a human being. But it took Kahneman and Tversky to demonstrate it rigorously and systematically, and to build an alternative theory that actually matches how people behave. The centerpiece of prospect theory is loss aversion, which is the finding that losses loom larger than equivalent gains, that the pain of losing a certain amount of money is roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the same amount, that people are much more strongly motivated to avoid losses than to acquire equivalent gains, and this asymmetry has enormous consequences for behavior, for how people make financial decisions, for how organizations behave, for how negotiations unfold, for how people respond to risk, Because if losses hurt more than gains feel good, then people will take irrational risks to avoid certain losses and will forgo certain gains to avoid uncertain outcomes. And this is exactly what you see. This is exactly the pattern of behavior that the theory predicts. Related to loss aversion is the endowment effect, which is the tendency to value things more once you own them than you valued them before you owned them, which makes no sense from a classical economics perspective, because the value of an object should not depend on who owns it, but it makes complete sense from a loss aversion perspective, because selling something you own feels like a loss, and losses are painful. So you demand more to give something up than you would have paid to acquire it in the first place. And this is why negotiating is hard, and why people hold on to things they should sell, and why the concept of sunk costs has such a powerful grip on decision-making. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in something because of the resources already invested rather than because of the future prospects, to throw good money after bad, to stay in a bad relationship because of the years already spent, to finish a terrible book because you are already 300 pages in. And it is a fallacy because the invested resources are gone regardless of what you do next. The decision about what to do next should be made purely on the basis of future costs and benefits, and yet the sunk costs feel like they matter, feel like abandoning the enterprise would mean they were wasted, and loss aversion is part of why. There is also the concept of reference points, which is the observation that people evaluate outcomes not in absolute terms, but relative to some reference point, and that this reference point is often the status quo, what you currently have, and that outcomes above the reference point feel like gains and outcomes below it feel like losses. And because of loss aversion, the losses feel worse than the gains feel good. And this means that your subjective experience of your circumstances depends not just on what your circumstances are, but on what you expected them to be, what you are comparing them to, and changing your reference point changes your experience, even when your actual circumstances remain constant. The book covers something called the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes, which is the observation that people's risk preferences are not consistent across different domains, but vary depending on whether they are dealing with high probability or low probability outcomes, and whether the outcomes involve gains or losses. And the pattern is this. People tend to be risk-averse when facing a high-probability gain, preferring a certain smaller gain to an uncertain larger one, and risk-seeking when facing a high-probability loss, preferring a gamble to a certain loss, even when the gamble has negative expected value, and risk-seeking when facing a very small probability of a large gain, overweighting the unlikely possibility, which is why people buy lottery tickets, and risk-averse when facing a very small probability of a large loss. Also overweighting the unlikely possibility, which is why people buy insurance, and this fourfold pattern explains a lot of seemingly inconsistent behavior, and also a lot of the ways in which people can be manipulated by how choices are framed. Framing is enormously important. The way a choice is presented, the way a question is asked, can dramatically change the answer even when the underlying facts are identical, and this is a direct consequence of the reference point dependence of loss aversion, because the framing sets the reference point. And if you frame an outcome as a loss from one reference point, you get different behavior than if you frame the identical outcome as a gain from a different reference point. And the classic demonstration of this is a public health scenario in which people are told that a disease is expected to kill 600 people, and they must choose between two programs. And in one version, program A will save 200 people for certain, and program B has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. And most people choose A, the certain option, because they are risk-averse in the domain of gains. And then in the other version, the same programs are described differently, as program C, under which 400 people will die for certain, and program D, under which there is a 1/3 chance that nobody will die and a 2/3 chance that all 600 will die. And most people choose D, the gamble, because they are risk-seeking in the domain of losses. And the key insight is that programs A and C are identical, and programs B and D are identical. Same lives saved, same probabilities. Same outcomes, just described differently. And yet the description changes the choice, reliably, predictably, and most people are entirely unaware that their preference shifted. After prospect theory, the book moves into questions about the nature of well-being and happiness, which might seem like a different topic, but turns out to be deeply connected to everything that came before, because Kahneman applies the same psychological tools to the study of happiness that he applied to the study of decision-making, and what he finds is equally surprising and somewhat troubling. There are, he argues, two selves, not unlike the two systems, and he calls them the experiencing self and the remembering self. And the experiencing self is the one that lives moment to moment in the continuous flow of experience, feeling what is happening as it happens, and the remembering self is the one that constructs narratives about the past and evaluates how experiences went and forms preferences about the future based on those evaluations. And the crucial insight is that these two selves do not always agree, that what the experiencing self lived through and what the remembering self recalls and values can be quite different, and that the remembering self is the one that makes decisions, the one that says whether to go back to that restaurant or take that vacation again or stay in that relationship, even though it does not necessarily have an accurate account of what the experiencing self actually went through. The remembering self, it turns out, operates according to two rules. The peak end rule, which says that an experience is evaluated primarily by how it felt at its peak intensity and how it felt at the end, with the duration largely ignored and duration neglect, which is exactly what it sounds like. The tendency to disregard how long an experience lasted when evaluating it, and these rules together produce some striking results, most famously demonstrated by a colonoscopy study, which is perhaps not the most glamorous context for a major scientific insight, but there you have it, in which patients who had a longer procedure but experienced a less severe ending rated the overall experience as less unpleasant than patients who had a shorter procedure with a more severe ending. even though by any objective measure, the longer procedure involved more total discomfort. The experiencing self suffered more, but the remembering self had a better story because the ending was better. This has implications for how we think about the quality of life and the design of experiences and the relationship between living a good life and remembering having lived one. Because if the remembering self makes our decisions, but the experiencing self does the actual living, then there is a gap, potentially a large one, between what we choose and what actually makes our lives feel good moment to moment. And understanding this gap is important for understanding why people sometimes make choices that seem to maximize the story of their lives rather than the actual experienced quality of their lives. Why people prefer endings. Why a vacation that ends badly can sour the whole memory of a trip that was otherwise wonderful. Why the final chapter of a relationship can reshape the entire narrative. Kahneman also makes a distinction between experienced well-being, which is how much positive emotion you feel in your actual daily life, and life satisfaction, which is how good you think your life is when you step back and evaluate it. And these two measures are related but not identical, and they are influenced by different things. And one of the important findings is that income affects life satisfaction a great deal. People with more money report more satisfaction with their lives. But its effect on day-to-day, experienced well-being plateaus at a surprisingly modest level of income, because beyond a certain point more money does not translate into more moment-to-moment positive emotion, does not change how pleasant Tuesday morning actually feels. And this is a finding with obvious relevance to how people think about what they are working toward and what they expect happiness to feel like when they get there. The focusing illusion is another important idea in this section of the book, which is the observation that whatever you happen to be thinking about when you evaluate your well-being gets weighted far too heavily in the evaluation. So that if you are asked whether you are happy right after being asked about your relationship, you weight your relationship more heavily than you would otherwise. And if you are asked whether you would be happier if you lived in California, people reliably overestimate the difference. Because they focus on the obvious difference, the weather, and fail to adequately account for all the other things that make up daily life. The commute, the housing costs, the work, the relationships, which are not very different in California than anywhere else. And the focusing illusion is summarized in a sentence that Kahneman clearly enjoys. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it, which is a profound and slightly melancholy observation about the nature of desire and anticipation and the imagination of future states. Throughout all of this, threading through the entire book like a quiet melody underneath the more dramatic harmonies, is the story of the collaboration between Kahneman and Tversky, two very different men who produced together something neither could have produced alone. And this story is not the main subject of the book, but it is present in the dedication, in the acknowledgements, in the way Kahneman writes about the work they did. With a warmth and affection and something close to grief that is moving in its restraint, and it gives the book a human dimension that pure intellectual exposition sometimes lacks, a sense of the fragility and luck involved in finding the right person to think with, the right partnership at the right time. The book also engages throughout with the practical question of what to do about all of this, how to make better decisions given that your mind is prone to these systematic errors. And the answer is somewhat humbling because the biases are deeply embedded and not easily overcome by simply knowing about them. Knowing about the anchoring effect does not make you immune to anchoring. Knowing about loss aversion does not make you evaluate losses and gains symmetrically. And Kahneman is honest about this in a way that is both discouraging and weirdly reassuring, because the honest acknowledgement that these things are hard is more useful than false promises that knowledge alone will fix them. What can help, the book suggests, is procedural, is building systems and checklists and decision-making processes that slow things down and force System 2 engagement at the moments when it matters most, is seeking out people who will disagree with you and challenge your conclusions, is being suspicious of your own confidence, especially in domains where feedback is slow and irregular, is treating decisions as policies rather than individual choices. Imagining the full range of people who might make this decision in similar circumstances, rather than thinking only about the specific case in front of you, is taking the outside view, looking at base rates and statistical regularities rather than getting lost in the vivid specific narrative of your particular situation. The outside view versus the inside view is a rich concept in the book, illustrated by a story about a curriculum development project that Kahneman was involved in which the team had been working for a year and were making a prediction about how long the project would take to complete. And Kahneman asked one of the team members, a curriculum expert, how long similar projects had taken. And the expert said that most such projects took 7 to 10 years, and a significant fraction were never completed. And then when Kahneman asked how long this project would take, the same expert said 2 years, because when you are inside a project, you see its specific virtues and its unique circumstances, and you build a story about it that does not include the possibility of failure or excessive delay, because your inside view is optimistic by construction, and the outside view, the base rate view, the view from statistical history, says something much more sobering, and the rational move is to take the outside view more seriously than intuition recommends, to anchor predictions in what actually happened to similar projects rather than in the compelling narrative of this particular one. This is related to the planning fallacy, which is the tendency to underestimate the time, cost, and risk of future actions while overestimating the benefits, which is almost universal in human experience. Projects take longer than expected, cost more than expected, produce fewer benefits than expected. And this happens again and again, and the experience of past over-optimism does not seem to correct it very much, because each new project feels different from the inside. Feels like it has special advantages that the failed projects lacked, and so the optimism persists even in the face of repeated disconfirmation. Optimism, Kahneman notes, is actually one of the most powerful forces in human economic life, because the planning fallacy and the illusion of control and the illusion of skill that it generates are what drive entrepreneurship. What make people start companies knowing that most companies fail? What make people accept risks that statistical reasoning would counsel against? And from a purely individual standpoint, these optimistic biases often lead to bad outcomes. But from a societal standpoint, the optimism of entrepreneurs and inventors drives economic growth and innovation and all the benefits that follow from them. So the bias that is irrational at the individual level may be functional at the collective level, which is a complicated thought and one that Kahneman does not try to resolve too neatly because it does not have a neat resolution. There is also an important discussion of the way risk is perceived and evaluated by large organizations, specifically by contrast with how a rational expected utility maximizer would evaluate it. And the argument is that organizations often take too little risk because their decision makers, being loss-averse individuals who are evaluated on outcomes, prefer to avoid gambles even when the expected value is positive. Prefer the certain mediocre outcome to the uncertain better on average one. And this risk aversion is individually rational for the managers making the decisions because they bear the cost of failure personally, through lost bonuses or damaged reputations, while the benefits of success are diffused through the organization. And this asymmetry creates systematic underinvestment in risky positive expected value opportunities. And the prescription is for organizations to evaluate portfolios of decisions rather than individual decisions, to commit in advance to accepting a certain number of failures as the necessary cost of also accepting the successes that come from the same risk-taking posture. The book ends with the two selves again, and with a meditation on what it means to live well given what we know about the experiencing self and the remembering self, and about the difficulty of knowing what we actually want from life, and whether our pursuit of it is well calibrated. And it does not offer easy answers because there are none, but it leaves you with something more valuable than easy answers, which is a richer and more honest understanding of the machinery that generates your preferences and judgments and decisions, a kind of informed humility about the extent to which you are in control of your own mind, and with that humility, a gentler and more forgiving curiosity about why people, including you, do the things they do and think the things they think. The mind, Kahneman shows us, is not a logic machine. It is not a calculator making optimal computations. It is a biological organ shaped by evolution to solve particular kinds of problems, good at some things and bad at others, fast and intuitive when it needs to be and slow and deliberate when it can afford to be, prone to certain errors in certain ways that are understandable and predictable once you know what to look for. And understanding these tendencies does not free you from them entirely, but it changes your relationship with them, makes you a more attentive observer of your own mental life, makes you slower to trust the confident feeling that everything is fine and you know exactly what is happening, makes you more willing to stop and ask whether this is a situation where your system one is likely to be leading you astray, whether the story you are constructing is too coherent to be true, whether you are more certain than the evidence warrants. Whether the framing of the choice you are facing might be shaping your preference in ways you have not noticed. There is something both humbling and strangely comforting about all of this. The recognition that the errors are not personal failures, not evidence of stupidity or weakness, but are features of a system that is mostly doing its best in conditions that are genuinely hard, that your brain is doing something extraordinary every moment of every day and doing it largely without your assistance, and that the places where it falls short are the places where the demands of the modern world exceed the design specifications of the ancient mind, and that knowing this, really knowing it, sitting with it, turning it over quietly in the warm darkness before sleep, is not a reason for despair, but a reason for patience, for slowness, for a certain gentle skepticism about the first confident thing that comes to mind, which after all might be System 1 talking, might be the fast system telling its vivid story, and it is worth pausing, just pausing, and asking if there is something the slow system would like to add. And if the slow system says nothing, if it is too tired to weigh in, if the deliberate, effortful mode of thinking has already signed off for the night and left the building, then that is fine too. That is perhaps the most understandable response of all. Because thinking is hard, and the book has given you a lot to think about, and the light is low, and the blankets are warm, and the heuristics and the biases and the two systems and the two selves and the peaks and the ends and the anchors and the frames and the losses and the gains are all settling gently now into the soft, undifferentiated quiet of almost sleep, where they will do their work without you, organizing themselves into the kind of knowledge that does not feel like knowledge. The kind that just makes you slightly different the next morning, slightly more patient with yourself and with other people, slightly more curious about the machinery, slightly more willing to say, I wonder if I am wrong about this, which is perhaps the most useful thing a book about thinking can leave you with. And it is enough, it is more than enough, it is good. Before we rest, a quiet word. A sleepy summary with its soft amber light is not meant to replace something. It is meant to point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose and every story they told and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow. And if this lamp has helped you in some way, a like and subscribe keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too.